All right, chapter 14, A New Birth of Freedom, the Civil War. On this slide, I want you guys to underline border states. They are right here. Border states will consist of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. You won't have to necessarily know which states are in border states. The most important thing to take away from the border states is that they had an influence upon Abraham Lincoln when he took office. These states, or I should say, when the American Civil War kicked off, these states decided that they weren't going to take part. They weren't going to join the Union. They weren't going to join the Confederacy. They decided to just stay neutral on the issue. And Lincoln was very worried about these states because he felt that any slight move or on his behalf, or I should say on the Union's behalf, could possibly push them towards joining the Confederacy. If you recall, simply sending resources to Fort Sumter had caused 4 more states to secede from the Union. So Lincoln is very uh, weary of these states. He wants to make sure that he doesn't push them to that edge, to that decision. And so, therefore, Lincoln's official statement on the war was that it was to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. So I want to make that very clear. That's Lincoln's stance at the beginning of this war, preserving the Union, not ending slavery. And a lot of that was influenced by these border states. One thing I wanted to remind you also that one of these border states is Missouri, which is a slave state. And so you see that there are some slave states that didn't freak out simply because Lincoln became president. And it's just oddly enough, these 11 states, they just could not fathom Lincoln as being president of the United States, and they took his election as a threat against their way of life, against their economy. Not all states did that. Missouri happened to be one of them. When it came to the conflict, it divided many parts of America. Obviously, it cut America in half, and it cut homes in half. You had some people that were from the North but fought for the South, some people from the South but fought for the North. Lincoln's own wife had 4 brothers who fought for the Confederacy, so you got to imagine Thanksgiving was awkward that year. Please underline the grays. And this will just simply be a term that you will apply for the Confederacy or the South. They called them the Grays, and when I say them, the soldiers, because they wore gray uniforms. Now, there are many advantages to the Confederacy. Number one, they're fighting a defensive fight, so they don't necessarily have to win. They just simply have to maintain and hold their position. There's a lot of advantages to a defensive fight. The same way you could hear somebody say, "Oh, they had a home field advantage." When defensive fights or home field advantage fights, there are initially better leaders. Lincoln originally wanted to tap the shoulder of Robert E. Lee to serve as the lead general for the forces, and he did. But Robert E. Lee will turn that down and argue that he was the son of Virginia, so he has to fight for the Confederacy. Whatever. That's neither here nor there. But there were a lot of good generals throughout the war. Many of them happen to be to pick with the or stick with the Confederacy. Number 3, there's a higher sense of morale because the Confederacy feels like they are fighting their very existence, socially and economically. Whereas they'll be different for the Blues, so we'll talk about them in a second. There are some disadvantages. Remember that the South is primarily an agrarian society. They don't have much. They do not have much industry, and they lack the infrastructure for transportation. So, as the war drags on, they're going to be short on supplies. They're not going to be able to fire cotton bullets. They're not going to be able to fire, tobacco bullets. So that they could be in some trouble when it comes to those supplies and run. Go ahead and underline the Blues. Excuse me. And the Blues are going to be identified by the Union, and these are the troops up north. The Blues, the Union, or the North. Those are the 3 terms that you would think that were synonymous with Blues. Again, they represent troops that fought for the Union forces or the North. They had advantages. 3/4 of the nation's wealth is located up north. 3/4 of the nation's railroad supply is located up north. They have a superior navy, which will enable them to create blockades later on in the conflict and possibly deny the shipment of foreign goods to the Confederate economy or the Confederate war effort. They have twice the size of the U.S. The southern population, and they have a constant flow of immigrants that they can then draft into the conflict. One problem with the Blues, the Union or the North, is that they have poor leadership, and this leadership will stem from arrogance and I think most of it is arrogance. Yeah, it has to be arrogance. These individuals did not think this war would last long. I believe Lincoln's administration thought that they could wrap this entire conflict up in 3 months. It goes to show that their ego got in front of their intelligence, and that leads to arrogance at times. Another difficult element for the North of the Union would be that they have to invade. And invading is difficult because you're going into foreign territory. You may not be completely knowledgeable of the area, and then you have to move someone from that square. So that means a conflict will take place, and it would be like fighting somebody who's decided to just sit down in a ball. What would you do and how would you do it? Picking them up would be difficult, and fighting them would look problematic. But that's the case right here. Please underline President Davis, and then please underline President Lincoln. You need to know that these are the two respective leaders during the Civil War. President Davis will be the selected leader for the Confederacy. President Lincoln was the elected leader of the Union. And there were some issues with the Confederacy I want to address. We have to remember that they take their name from the notion of the Articles of Confederation, where they gave a great deal of power to the states. So much so that one defect of the Confederacy was that states could secede from the Confederacy. They believed in that notion of states' rights so much so that they were willing to allow a state to secede from the Confederacy during a time in which they could not afford for that state to secede, because then it would make the Confederacy even weaker as the Union is trying to preserve itself. Some states would refuse to serve outside their own borders. And if that should ring any bell, that should sound exactly like Shays' Rebellion, where people felt that, hey, this isn't my problem. We're going to stay out of it. If you have troops that are in need, say in Tennessee, and there's nothing going on in Georgia, well, then we need to relocate and allocate troops appropriately so that way we can be successful on all fronts. We have to look out for each other in that respect. It's kind of like today when we look at people struggling, I guess, with supplies, especially medical supplies. You would think that states, if they had a surplus, they would be able to assist those areas that are hit hardest. With the issue that we're dealing with today. Davis often had disputes with his own Congress, whereas Lincoln enjoyed, for the most part, a cooperative and financially stable and recognized government. That doesn't mean that people in Lincoln's cabinet didn't agree with him. There are always people around Lincoln who felt that they could have been a better president, for sure. But nonetheless, these are the two presidents. They will have to navigate this Civil War. Some of it, or I should say, none of it, is going to be easy for either of them. Now, on this slide, I'm not going to have you guys underline anything. I do want to stress, though, that at times during war, the people will be presented with a notion that for the sake of their security, they must give up some liberties. When Rome would be attacked, the Senate would dissolve and they would elect a dictator, a Caesar, to control and maintain the empire. Once the conflict was over, the Caesar was to step down and the republic could resume. However, power and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, and the Caesar would oftentimes stay in power for long periods of time. When the war broke out, Congress was not in session, and so Lincoln had to act. So Lincoln proclaims a blockade. He increases the size of the federal army, and then he suspends habeas corpus, which is a pretty sketchy situation. Habeas corpus is, in essence, your right to due process. When you get charged with a crime, they can detain you. And when I say they, officers, police officers, but ultimately they have to let you go if they do not charge you with the crime. If they've charged you with the crime, then you must have your day in court. You must present your case in front of a judge, plead guilty or not guilty. And then if you want to have your day in court, it has to be in front of a jury with a trial of jury of your peers. When you're denied any of that without, any type of charge, or that's called the denial of due process. That's suspending habeas corpus. So that's exactly what Lincoln does, and he does that because he wants to, root out any type of Confederate spies that he believes or his intelligence agencies believe could be in the Union. Um, and it's a tough situation. Would we, if we were battling a war, would we be comfortable with the government today just arresting people and placing them in jail, not charging them with anything? And you got to understand how uh, difficult that would be, and how much of a strain that would be on your life if you were in jail for no reason at all. No, but you were suspected of something, and now you're missing a day of work. Your kids don't know where you are for a whole day, and that could be weeks, that could be months. You don't know. Again, there's no end to this. Now that seems sketchy. What's even sketchier is that Lincoln does this without the approval of Congress, and all three items require the approval of Congress. Arguments by many people are that, well, during times of war, you get like an extended leash, if you will, to do this or to do that, to do what is necessary in order to win the war. And that brings up a great deal of question regarding ethics. Um, and I'm not going to say what's right or wrong. I will say that that's a very difficult position, and these are very difficult decisions. Go ahead and underline the draft. I don't see it. Or we could. It's right here, but it doesn't say the draft. But just be aware that in 1863, Lincoln will initiate a federal draft law, and men are called into the draft. Like if the troops come to your town or whatever, and they feel like, well, we need 300 men, and therefore they're going to assign everybody a draft number. And when they assign you a draft number and they come to your town, you have to report to the draft. And if they pull your number, you need to step forward. And when you step forward, welcome to the Army. If you do not step forward, you could be put in jail for sure. Now, if you could afford to pay $300 in cash at that moment, then you could avoid entering the draft. I think what we Googled it later on, $300 is like the equivalent of like $5,000 or something like that in cash today. And you just got to know that what that kind of implies is that this is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. That we're initiating a draft in this conflict bothers a great deal of people because we tend to pride ourselves on our volunteer army. And a lot of times, people will volunteer under certain ideas of service, especially like after 9/11, you had a great deal of people volunteering to enter the service. In this case, the war is still presented as, remember initially, Lincoln said that this was a war to preserve the Union. Uh, After the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, this will now be a war to end slavery. And for some people, it bothered them that they were going to be drafted into a war to end slavery when they could care less. And so a great deal of racial tension will develop from this draft law. The Confederacy will pass a similar draft, but the fact that we even have to draft people at all implies that this wasn't a very popular war. It was being drugged out longer than people expected. It was a very bloody war, um, and people were scared. And then you have the government taking incredible action, mandating the drafting of American citizens. Please underline the Battle of Bull Run. This is a battle. July 21st, 1861. It's the first battle of the American Civil War, and the Confederacy win. Again, the Union thought that things were sweet, that they would be able to easily defeat the Confederacy, but under the leadership of Stonewall Jackson, the Confederates, these ragtag group of Southern soldiers, ultimately defeat the Union forces. And at the battle in which they call Manassas. And from the Southern perspective, they call this battle the Battle of Manassas. From the Northern perspective, they call it the Battle of Bull Run. Nonetheless, it's a Confederate victory, and it proved that this American Civil War was going to be a long and bloody war. Please underline General George McClellan, and then underline General Robert E. Lee. These are the preeminent, or I should say, these are the leading major generals of the American Civil War. General George McClellan will be the lead general for the Union, and General Robert E. Lee will be the lead general of the Confederate Army. That's all I really need you guys to know about it, that these individuals exist. There will be many generals to speak of. At the outset, McClellan, he's not passive, but he's not pursuant. Like Lincoln wanted him to go and fight and go and get Robert E. Lee and hurry up and end this conflict. McClellan had a great deal of disdain for Lincoln and would oftentimes just, ignore and therefore disobey some of the suggestions. And McClellan would not be actively involved in the conflict, even though he is the leader of the army, and this will be a problem in the beginning. For Robert E. Lee, he's just trying to maintain his army, secure victories as many as possible, but he is probably aware that in the long run, this will not last. The Confederacy probably will not be able to pull this out if this happens to be a long war, that the resources are just not there. Please underline Antietam. So McClellan will lose at the Battle of Richmond. Lee will have another victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and then Lee presses on into Maryland. So what I want to take away from that first bullet point is that the Union is not winning battles as they thought that they should. The Confederacy is stacking up victories, and it gives Robert E. Lee the military capital to press on into Maryland. Now, Lee will meet McClellan at Antietam, and McClellan is able to discover Lee's battle plans and ultimately halts the offensive. It's considered an offensive. Maryland is a border state, and McClellan, thanks to intelligence and espionage, is able to secure the battle plans of Robert E. Lee, and therefore he knows where he's going to be, how much is he bringing, what time is he going to be there, and that enables McClellan's forces to not even counter, but intercept more often than not, and cause a great deal of damage. Antietam will be an incredibly bloody battle. Not the bloodiest, but it will be a very bloody battle. Probably the bloodiest single day battle, and the Confederacy will lose. Now, due to this loss, Lincoln now feels he has the political capital. This Union victory will give Lincoln the political capital to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamations. Go ahead and underline that. It's right here. With the victory at Antietam, Lincoln feels he can issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and this will change the direction of this war. This is now a war to end slavery. Lincoln understood more than anyone else that the only way we could truly preserve the Union was if we ended slavery. If we ended this conflict and did it in slavery, it would be a matter of time before we fought over this issue again, and therefore there is no preservation of Union in that sense. If we're here to fight this fight, if we're here to preserve the Union sincerely, we have to end slavery. Now, did the Emancipation Proclamation actually free slaves? In the outset, absolutely not. The Emancipation Proclamation has no authority to free any slaves. As far as the Confederates are concerned, they're like, okay, cool, that's what you think. Good for you, but we're not doing it. Secondly, Lincoln, in his Emancipation Proclamation, argued that slaves only in rebellion states should be freed. Okay, so notice he's only targeting slaves in rebellion states. He's not targeting the slaves that are in the border states. They're protected. They can still do whatever they want to do. Because again, Lincoln was worried that those states would secede and join the Confederacy, making them stronger. So what exactly did the Emancipation Proclamation do? Well, it changed the direction of the war, and then it added a moral element to the war. You know, if you couldn't get behind the notion of preserving the Union, or maybe even that concept was a bit over your head, like what does it mean to preserve the Union? Why do I want to preserve the Union? And then now you have this notion that the war is to end slavery. Well, that would give it a stronger moral cause to preserve the Union and ultimately free slaves, and for people to get in and fight.